like to talk now about a very abstract notion, but one which lies at the heart of consumer theory, and that is the idea of a utility function. Now, economics is all about making choices, consumers trying to do the best they can with a budget constraint, and the way that we analyze that happiness and that choice is by use of a utility function, at least in more formal models of consumer behavior. Now, as a function, we write it traditionally in this way, that we say that the benefits to a consumer of consuming good X and good Y depend on some utility function U. Now, there are various forms of a utility function that are used in practical economic analysis, but I want to leave it general right now. We just say that happiness depends on how much consumption of good X and how much consumption of good Y the consumer will get. Now, this is when you use indifference curves, for example, that is, those are drawn for a given level of utility, which really has at its basis this concept of a utility function. So when we talk about indifference curves, that's going to be an important role. Now, when we discuss utility functions, one of the things that often comes into play is the idea of marginal utility. Now, let me write this up. So marginal utility is the benefit to the consumer of consuming one more unit of a good, say good X. Now, the way I will write that is the marginal utility of X. It's the extra happiness you get by consuming one more unit of X. We also have a corresponding marginal utility of Y. Now, these are very abstract notions because most consumers couldn't tell you what's the extra happiness you get by having one more cup of coffee or buying one more shirt. We don't really have a specific measure of what, how much happiness a consumer might get from consuming one more unit. But in an abstract notion, it's actually quite helpful. Now, we'll come back to how we use that in just a moment. Now, a frequent assumption is that there are diminishing margin utility for consuming more goods, more of a good. So my first cup of coffee in the morning, I get a big punch out of it. I get a lot of happiness out of that. In fact, for me in the morning without my first cup of coffee is a sad sight to behold indeed. Second cup of coffee is not as important. Third cup, not really that important to me. I get less happiness the more I consume of this good. We have this idea of diminishing marginal utility as a frequent assumption about how consumers will react to consuming more of a good. Now, let me say up front that there are some instances where you get more and more benefits for the first few units of something that you buy. It just gets better and better and better. But at some point, there's going to be diminishing happiness from getting more of a good. At some point, you get tired of something. For a lot of what you do in an economics class, you assume that there's diminishing marginal utility from the start, so that you get less and less benefit the more and more you consume of a good. Now, we've got an important concept that is based on this idea of marginal utility, which you may have already sort of gotten a sense of, which is the demand curve. A demand curve really represents the marginal utility of consuming a good. So let's give our old familiar demand curve. And we've talked about how the height of a demand curve represents the willingness to pay. Okay, the height of a demand curve is the willingness to pay for a good. Now, how much am I willing to pay? Well, that probably depends on how many jollies I get out of it, how many utils I get out of it, what my marginal utility is. So you can think of the height of a demand curve is the willingness to pay or the marginal utility. The first unit, I get this much utility. The second unit, that much utility. The third unit, that much utility. The more and more I buy of this good, the less benefit I get. Or you could think about this as different consumers who value the purchase of something differently. So the first consumer values it this much, the second consumer values it that much, and you line everybody up and you get this diminishing or a downward sloping demand curve, which lies, and at its heart, it's really about falling utility from consuming more and more of the good. Okay, so very important idea embodied in a demand curve is the marginal utility. Now, with a single demand curve, we don't write in the marginal utility of alternative goods. Now, when you talk about substitutes and complements, you get that sort of idea. So my marginal utility of one good will in part depend on what the price of other goods might be, what the alternatives might be. So utility functions very much at the heart of consumer theory. And I'm just going to make a quick reference to something that's dealt with in the video about indifference curves, but I just want to sort of remind you about, or link it here, that when we talk about indifference curves, where you have a fixed level of utility, a fixed level of happiness, you can look at changes in the utility from a couple of different ways. One, we can think about how my utility changes when I change my consumption of good X or good Y by only one unit. In other words, the marginal utility. And we can look at the change in the quantity consumed of X. So this tells you how much utility will change when I change the units of X by this amount and multiply that by the marginal utility. We can get the same thing with the change in Y. You can then express the overall impact of changing consumption of good X and good Y along an indifference curve. Which is equal to 0, and you get the marginal rate of substitution. But embedded in that discussion about indifference curves is this idea of marginal utility. So it really is an important part of consumer theory. So that's a quick introduction to utility functions and how they relate to demand functions, which we're all very familiar with.